Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. We're going to wrap up our conversation about entrepreneurial opportunities by looking specifically at the context in which an opportunity is commercialized to understand its longer-term attractiveness. So we've already talked about the customer demand side of things. We're now going to focus specifically on long-term profits. We're only going to address one specific framework, Porter's 5 forces. From a learning perspective, you could use some of the lean startup theories to explore whether or not an opportunity is profitable, in particular by working with a business model and looking at the critical assumptions in that business model. But we're going to talk about business models separately in this course. And so for right now, we're going to approach this from a predictive framework and specifically using Porter's 5 forces. So what makes a good idea? One of the elements you want to consider is that you'd like to be in an attractive industry. So the question we have to ask is, what makes an industry attractive? Well, some industries are more profitable than others, and Porter's 5 forces analysis helps us understand which industries are likely to be profitable. So why are we using industry analysis? Well, we can sometimes refer to this as the Willie Sutton theory of strategy. Willie Sutton was a very famous bank robber. And he was once asked, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And his response was, "Well, that's where the money is." So we can anticipate the most profitable industries and try to enter them, hoping that profitability will increase or stay high, and avoid industries where profitability is expected to decline or remain low. One way to think about this is, if you're working in a very poor industry, no matter how good a manager you are, your overall profitability is likely to be limited. Whereas in really great industries where the overall industry is very profitable, you could be a mediocre manager and still do quite well. So we want to then ask, what drives the profitability of an industry? Porter's 5 forces gives us a model that identifies these 5 specific forces: threat of entry, buyer power, substitutes, supplier power, and rivalry. All of these forces press on an industry and try to reduce its profitability. So if there's a high threat of entry, that is, it's easy for other companies to get into an industry, if buyers in an industry have a lot of power, or suppliers have a lot of power, or there are a lot of substitutes, or rivalry is very intense, then we would expect the profitability of the overall industry to be lower. That makes it's a less attractive industry when profits are low. So we can look at an example like the restaurant industry, which of course is exactly what we've been pondering for the last couple of conversations. In the restaurant industry, supplier power is relatively low, and that's because most of the supplies that restaurants use, food commodities, silverware, furniture, even things like the labor associated with waitstaff and servers, all of these things are sort of commodities. They're all things that we can find on the open market. If we're not happy buying napkins from one supplier, we can probably buy them from another. So suppliers don't have a lot of power in this industry. If a supplier said, we're charging you twice as much for napkins this month as we did last month, our response might be, well, I think we'll switch. We'll just get our napkins somewhere else. On the other hand, almost all of the other forces in the restaurant industry are pretty strong. There's a high threat of entry. It's not that difficult to open a restaurant. Yes, there's a certain amount of money involved, but that money can be raised from friends, family, or banks. Buyers do have a lot of power because they can simply choose to walk away. If we are not meeting their needs in some way, there's very little cost for them to choose to go to a different restaurant. They can't negotiate prices so much, although sometimes you can. But on the whole, if a buyer's unhappy with a restaurant, they can simply go to another one. There's many substitutes for going to a restaurant. You can get takeout, you could buy your food at a grocery store and cook it at home, and so on. And finally, there's a tremendous amount of rivalry in the restaurant industry. In any given city or town, there's going to be many, many restaurants all competing with each other, often for the same kinds of customers. And so what we can conclude from this is that overall, the forces that press on the restaurant industry are relatively high. We had 4 high forces and 1 low force. And we would expect then that the overall profitability of the restaurant industry is relatively low, and historically that has been the case in the United States. Now, this doesn't mean that any one restaurant can't be successful. There's always examples of great restaurants that are very, very successful. But overall, taking this as a statistical average, the profitability of the restaurant industry is not very good. One aspect of this that tends to be very confusing is threat of entry, and that's because students often misunderstand where their perspective is. Students think, I want to enter the restaurant industry, and so therefore I want the barrier of entry to be low, right? The barrier of entry is the opposite of the threat of entry. So students say, I want there to be a big threat of entry because I want to be able to get into this industry. But that's the wrong way to think about it from an industry attractiveness perspective. From an industry attractiveness perspective, we want to imagine that we're in the industry already. We're already in the castle. And so the question is, once we're in the castle, are we better off if there's a road or if there's a moat, right? So the challenge here is that sometimes 5 forces is shown with barriers to entry instead of threat of entry. That can be very confusing because it's the reverse of all the others. When barriers to entry are high, then profitability is also high. This is why we usually try to talk about threat of entry, because then it's treated like a force, like all of the other 4 forces. So again, keep this perspective in mind. You're not evaluating this as if you want to get into the industry. You're evaluating it as if you are already in the industry and you're trying to understand how profitable it is. And the threat of lots of other companies entering reduces the profitability and attractiveness of a given industry. So there are lots of ways to create those threats of entry. Brand name can be very powerful. Think about things like the Apple brand or Coca-Cola. Patents can legally protect your technology, prevent other people from using it. There can be network effects or high switching costs. Network effect is once enough people are using something, it becomes a standard, something like eBay. It would be very hard to break into the online auction space right now. Scale economies, once you've become very big, you can get scale economies which reduce your costs, and that makes it harder for other companies to enter. You do have to be careful about situations in which you're generating something completely new. For example, the classic case of the Pebble watch, which was a crowdfunded venture creating these smartwatches. And it was a very good idea. There's no question about it. The problem is that Pebble effectively created this entire field. But what happened was, once they had done this, then other companies could step in, companies like Apple and Fitbit, who benefited from all the hard work that Pebble did, but were able to operate much more successfully because they had other kinds of capabilities already in place. So sometimes the fact that there's not a well-defined industry can fool you into thinking that there's an attractive opportunity when ultimately there's not, simply because the industry is not functioning in a way to allow you to analyze it yet. So these are tricky ones. You do have to watch out for them anytime you're effectively creating an entirely new industry space. So we want to emphasize here that this aspect of opportunity attractiveness and evaluating an entrepreneurial opportunity sometimes requires you to both evaluate the company's opportunity as well as the overall industry opportunity. These are not the same. Porter's 5 forces can only be used to evaluate an industry, not a company, an industry. What it means is that while great execution can create profits in bad industries, it's pretty hard work. And wherever possible, you want to work in an industry where just being average gets you above average profits. Examples of this include fields like pharmaceuticals, where average profitability is incredibly high. That's compared to things like the restaurant industry or the airlines, where broadly speaking profitability has been low. And there are structural factors that you could do a five forces analysis to think about why, to understand why that is. The bottom line here, though, is really an important lesson. There are some factors that determine how attractive your opportunity is that are out of your control. You may be able to determine which industry you go into, but the industry's overall profitability is partly, at least partly, if not entirely, out of your control, unless you can completely change the industry structure, which is pretty rare. That's a really important lesson for entrepreneurs, that it's not just about how cool your idea is or whether it meets market demand or even whether you can execute well. Some aspects of how profitable your business is going to be over the long haul are going to be driven by the overall industry dynamics, and some of those elements are going to be out of your control. So this concludes our conversation about entrepreneurial opportunities and opportunity attractiveness, and hopefully we've given you all sorts of things to think about in understanding why some opportunities are more or less attractive than others.